All right, it's another episode of Tom Kennedy Science. Now, I haven't made one of these in a while, so what I'm doing is I'm going to update all of my lectures for Bio 1140. Yeah, I know, there's going to be a few because some of these videos I realize are like 7 years old, but it's 2024 and time to update. We're better to start than emergent properties with life in the universe. So this is part of my Bio for Health Related Sciences lecture series, and emergent properties are really important. So emergent properties and cells are the basic unit of life, and emergent properties beyond cells like organisms, ecosystems, biosphere are going to be some of the topics we talk about today. So, emergent property, what is it? Okay, simply put, an emergent property just means you are greater than the sum of your parts. All right, now that's a warm up. Let's get a little bit more complete answer, a little more philosophical here. But emergent properties, these are novel features of systems that arise with increasing complexity. And interestingly, novel properties or these emergent properties, you can't always predict them. So you can't always predict some of your behaviors based on just knowing about protons, neutrons, and electrons. Interesting, I talk about that because the universe is made up of matter and energy. We're talking stars, rocks, galaxies, and life, from the bacteria that's growing on your teeth right now to a human, a whale, a bat, a dolphin. Oh, I just mentioned all vertebrates, of course, but all living things, everything in the universe is made up of matter. And matter is defined as having mass and occupying space. Now, for all you physicists out there, that's of course the Pauli exclusion principle that matter can occupy the same space at the same time. So here's an example of emergent properties, starting with the very beginnings or the very basic building blocks of life in the universe. You see, we are made up of atoms, but atoms themselves are actually made up of these subatomic particles. Now, in biology, we care about protons, neutrons, and electrons. Yeah, photons too. But we're not going to get into those right now. We're not going to get into the quarks and the gluons and all these fermions and bosons and baryons. No, we're going to stick with protons, neutrons, and electrons. These are the three subatomic particles that make up atoms. So basically, you take protons and neutrons, they are in the nucleus of an atom, okay? And the electrons are outside of the nucleus, and there are about 92 different elements made up by varying the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So basically, if you change the number of protons, you get a new element. So hydrogen, one proton, right? That's it, one proton. But if you have 6 protons, most of the time you have 6 neutrons. Sometimes 7, sometimes 8. You'll always have 6 electrons. And guess what? You have the element carbon. Add another proton. One more. Now you got 7. That's nitrogen. One more. You have 8. That would be oxygen, and so on. Now, these elements, of which there are 92 naturally occurring elements, anything heavier than uranium, 92, is, well, they're made probably in some of the largest explosions in the universe, like in supernovas, but they don't last very long. So we say that, anything up to about 92 is natural. Now, these elements combine to form molecules. So here's our emergent properties, right? Protons have a positive charge, neutrons have a neutral charge, electrons have a negative charge. You have 6 protons, you get carbon, it's a solid. You have 8 protons, you get oxygen, it's a gas. Now, I can take these elements and combine them into molecules. So for example, I can take 2 hydrogen atoms, which are gas, combine them to an oxygen atom, which is also a gas, and you get water, which is a liquid at room temperature. And we can make over millions and millions and millions of different types of chemicals just by arranging different elements together and holding together with chemical bonds. And in fact, we actually don't fully know the entire protein universe of all the different elements. And when it comes to life, There's so many different proteins, so many different molecules. Uh, Proteins, of course, are made up of other building blocks called amino acids, which are also made up of different elements. Oh gosh, there are 20 different amino acids. These building blocks make up millions of proteins. We're still figuring out, like I said, all the chemistry of life in the universe. But the difference here is, or the important thing here is that when you combine these different elements, you get different molecules, and different molecules have different properties. Okay, now we're going up in the hierarchy of life. We're increasing in complexity, which means we're getting more new novel characters. So like taking two gases together and getting a liquid, or we take sodium and chlorine. Sodium is a metal that catches on fire in water. Chlorine is a gas that will kill you. Put them together, you have table salt. But as we go up in complexity, there's this really important transition, and this is to cells. And cells are made up of lots of different molecules, which in turn are made up of the elements, which in turn are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. But cells are really important because they are the basic unit of life. It is the cell where all of these properties of life emerge. And how we define life, well, that's complicated. That's another videos I've made. And yeah, I've got to update some of that too, even though I've made one just 3 years ago. In the last 3 years, I've kind of changed my views on what life is. But regardless of how we define life or describe life or think about the things that it does, those actions of life, those properties or characteristics of life emerge at the level of cells. So cells are very important because, like I said, that's a transition from things that are living to non-living. And to be precise, life itself is an emergent property. It's a novel property of a complex system. And we can think of a system as like a cell. It's got a membrane surrounding it, and it's got all this chemistry inside of it, all these interacting components. That's our system, surrounded, like I said, by our barrier. Now, cell biologists, we study how cells work. They may study things like an endomembrane system. They may study mitosis, how photosynthesis works, cellular respiration, or the other thousands of different types of metabolic pathways that occur inside of cells. And there's a lot. Bacteria really have a lot of different metabolic pathways. And so do our cells as well. But we can continue upwards in this hierarchy of life and in emergent properties. Well, you and I, we're not just a single cell. We are multicellular life, like all plants and fungus and animals. And we are made up of billions of cells. And if you're the size of a human or bigger, trillions of cells. And right here, this is a purple reef lobster. His name was rock lobster, and he is a multicellular organism. And these cells, even though cells are incredibly complex, they all work together to make a multicellular organism, which also has emergent properties. I am greater than the sum of our parts. And just think about this. You know this from day-to-day interactions. You know, every person you meet is slightly different from somebody else. You know what? We all have the same three fundamental building blocks: protons, neutrons, and electrons. We have all the same elements in us: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, sodium, potassium, chlorine, magnesium, iron, right? We have the same 200 different cell types. We have the same 4 tissue types. We have the same organs. Our muscles and nerves all work the same way, yet we are all different from each other due to novel properties of how all these chemistry inside of us and the information inside of us is working. So that's pretty amazing. Okay, well, no organism lives isolated, and that's a topic of another lecture I'm going to give. But we continue. You take an organism, well, an organism is a species. And all the individuals of a single species form a population. And there's an entire field of ecology called population ecology that studies what makes populations grow, what makes them shrink. So these are snow geese. These are down at the Bosque del Apache. There were 30,000, literally 30,000 maybe 40,000 snow geese down there at the Bosque del Apache, which is a national wildlife refuge south of Albuquerque. So, yeah. So all these populations, and then the individuals in the population, guess what? They're going to interact as well. Think about how you interact with your friends and how interactions are different depending on who you're with. Once again, nothing lives in isolation, not even a single species. All species live in a biological community. And a biological community is basically all the different species living in a defined area, kind of basically determined by your questions. Well, we won't get into what constitutes exactly a biological community, other than the fact it's all the different species living together. So for those of us here in Albuquerque and New Mexico, we have the beautiful Rio Grande River. And yes, there are fish in that desert river. And all the fish in that river would form a biological community. Now, the organisms that live in a river or in any community also must interact not only with each other, they also interact with the non-living component, their physical environment. What's the soil like? What's the water like? What's the climate like? And this is an ecosystem. And ecosystems are all the living things interacting with each other and their physical environment. And then when it comes to where I'm from, I grew up in the Pine Flatwoods. I love this picture. It's really, the colors popped. I didn't do a lot to enhance that photo, actually. The sun was shining behind me and there's a big thunderstorm in front of me. So the clouds are dark with light on these trees, which really made the colors pop. But this is an example of an ecosystem. It's a pine flatwoods near the coast, and it's got all these different organisms that must interact with the amount of water and even some salinity in the soil there. Okay, there are lots of ecosystems, and ecosystems that function on a similar basis. Think out here in New Mexico, desert. Whether you're in the Sahara Desert, the Namibia Desert, the Sonoran Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, the whatever desert you're in. Well, they all operate pretty much the same, right? They get hot during the summertime. They're water limited, but lots of heat and the energy in the summertime. But all the organisms there have to be adapted to dry environments. So even though you might be in the Sahara or the Namibia Desert, they're going to have very different species than in the Chihuahua or the Sonoran Desert, but they're still operating the same way. And similarly functioning ecosystems form biomes. And when we take all the different types of biomes, we have desert, which is, I've got up there at Monument Valley, and I've got the Sonora Desert and White Sands. But all of these things come together to form the Earth, which is a biosphere. Because even all of these biomes are connected to each other. We have large-scale circulation patterns, meaning we have large wind patterns that move energy from the tropics to the poles. We have global circulation of ocean currents that also move and transfer heat long distances. So all of these different biomes are totally connected to each other. And to reiterate here, at each scale, I mean, going all the way back up to those protons, neutrons, and electrons, right? We see novel properties arising at the level of atoms, 92 different atoms. We have different molecules formed by the different elements. We have different molecules making up cells, and that just keeps going right on up. And there you have it. So that's emergent properties. That is a hierarchy of life. And importantly, don't forget that life emerges at the level of the cell.